am referring to Plato's Allegory of the Cave in Volume 7 of his dialogue books, The Republic. Plato's allegory ends in a celebration, the celebration of freedom in a brand new world that had not been recognized before to even exist, much less had been built. The cave allegory is the story of a people who have been held in a cave deep inside a mountain. They have been there for so long that their dark world has gradually become the only world they knew. The people were laid in chains. The chains were fastened behind the wall in the cave. The rock-encrusted world was the only world they knew. The light they could see was largely the light from a fire that was maintained on the other side of the wall. The light was reflected off the rocks of the cavern in front of them and above them. In the faint glow of the light, huge shadow images were created, shadows of objects that hired actors passed in front of the fire. These shadows that the captives all were able to behold with their senses became a reality to them, a reality they could relate events to, which in part defined their world. Plato used the cave allegory to explore the dynamics of despotic education. He asks us to suppose that mankind has been dwelling in this cave and has been since childhood as prisoners. Then, one day, everything begins to change. Someone manages to break away from the chains and cautiously ventures to the other side of the wall. With great amazement, the prisoner, that is then no longer chained to the ground, begins to observe the process that creates the shadows that had defined his world. The person who experiences this awakening thereby becomes free in more than one way. He sees the fire and also sees the objects that obscure the light, that thereby create magnified shadow images of the shape of the objects placed in the line of the light. The thereby self-freed prisoner begins to understand that the mythology of his world of shadows that he had related to is not real, but is merely a construct of delusions based on the limitations of his perceptions. He also understands the fire behind the wall, the source of their light, to be artificial, contrary to the beliefs they all had accepted as the light of the world. Then, in the distance, far behind the fire, the self-freed person discovers another light, a light that is natural. With it, he discovers that there exists an exit from the cave of shadows and illusions. Past the exit, the self-freed person suddenly discovers a whole new world, where all is light, a world of blinding sunlight that he soon understands to be the glorious nature of the real universe. Of course, the thereby self-freed person discovers that he isn't a prisoner anymore. When we, like the self-freed person, break free from the chains that bind our existence, when we see the fire behind the wall and see the process that causes the shadows and observe the masters of the process wielding their puppets that cast shadows, then we begin to understand the process that bound us to delusions more powerfully than the chains actually had. Historically, the Allegory was written in the wake of a great national tragedy, the Peloponnesian War, in which Greece was militarily defeated, but not before it was self-defeated by the sophistry of Pericles, the war crier of the time, who spake of greatness, while he really meant war, domination, destruction, looting, and thievery. With the allegory of the cave, Plato explores the effect of education, which can be used to shackle society with mental chains. He also illustrated that when the chains are broken, a process begins that enables society to really discover the world and find its freedom in it. The advent of Christ Jesus stands as a phase shift in history that created a whole new world, akin to a people of spiritual discoverers stepping past the exits from the traditional caves, buoyant with the recognition that they are not prisoners anymore and no longer bound to time-honored doctrines. The allegory is relevant to our modern time, for society gaining its freedom from imprisoning doctrines such as imperial monetarism, nuclear war terror, and as of late, the doctrine of man-made global warming. For example, the doctrine of man-made global warming has imprisoned society into believing that its economies, its industries, even its very existence, which are all carbon-intensive, are endangering the planet and will cause its climate to overheat. Here, society is chained behind the wall of ignorance and watches the shadows of the carbon scare theater. In this theater, tiny puppet objects are placed in the light of the fire that casts enormous shadow images into the imprisoned society's world. With decades of scare images imposed on its mentality, the targeted society is bidden to sacrifice its living by creating itself an energy-lean world choked with collapsed industries and with carbon taxes exceeding 100% for some commodities. As mortal prisoners, society willingly pays the price to save the earth, except for a few who dare to awake. Some people, those who awoke and have shed their chains, have climbed over the wall of ignorance and have discovered the fake process that creates the illusions. The number of the people who have gained their freedom from illusions in this manner in the carbon scare theater has increased to 50,000 scientists over the years. These now more awake people would have caused an insurrection in the despotic prison if they could. But no one would listen. Those who had remained chained behind the wall of ignorance lacked the mental vision to respond and to understand what the 50,000 self-liberated discoverers were saying to them. They actually defended their imprisonment in the theater of illusions. The worldwide effort by the scientific pioneers to free society thereby became ineffective, just as the elite had expected. Only a very few of the science pioneers had opened their mental horizon still further and had discovered the exit from the cave. They discovered an exit from the paradox in the form of scientific measurements that deliver hard proof that the great global warming that had rescued humanity from the Little Ice Age in the 1700s had been the direct result of the upramping of the sun. This massive global warming caused by the upramped sun included also the sharp global warming increase that had occurred in roughly the same time frame of the Industrial Revolution. And why shouldn't this type of massive global warming that has occurred not have occurred when the big guy in the sky ramps up, with the solar activity increasing for 300 years? When the big guy in the sky revs up, the effects affect everything. The climate gets warmer. The warming by the increased solar activity continued for almost 300 years. Several different types of measurements have been conducted, which all tell the same story, and all point to the sun. Carbon as a greenhouse gas is far too minuscule to even enter the global climate scene. The carbon greenhouse effect has been vastly magnified in the theater of the Cave of Deception. In real terms, the man-made contribution to the global greenhouse is no bigger than a mouse in comparison with the World Trade Towers that some people might still remember. Just look at the numbers. The energy absorption coefficient for carbon dioxide, the vilified greenhouse gas, is 10 times smaller than that of water vapor that furnishes most of the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere in the high 90% range, which is also directly affected by the sun. The rest of the greenhouse effect is produced by the energy absorption of oxygen in the air and the Rayleigh scattering effect. In comparison, CO2, which is 100 times less dense than water vapor and is effective only in a few narrow bands at the low energy end of the solar radiation spectrum, has no practical effect at all on the energy dynamics of the atmosphere. The total CO2 effect is no bigger than a cat in comparison with the World Trade Towers, and if the cat could be overfed to become the size of a horse, it still wouldn't amount to anything significant in the overall context. In real terms, the man-made contribution to atmospheric CO2, which has an insignificant effect to begin with, amounts to a mere 3%. And even that small man-made amount gets largely removed in the recycling process through the oceans. A third of all atmospheric CO2 gets recycled through the oceans every year. The CO2 increase that has been measured in modern time is evidently not man-made, for the simple reason that the CO2 concentration is highly responsive to climate factors and is not the cause for them. The current CO2 increase is also the result of the long recycle time in the conveyor belt of ocean currents that transports the CO2 that is being dissolved in the frigid Arctic waters to the warm, low-latitude regions, where the dissolved CO2 becomes a gas again and returns to the atmosphere. The cycle time for this system is in the range of hundreds of years. Some of the CO2 increase in modern time obviously stems from the vastly larger volumes of CO2 that had been dissolved into the oceans during the Little Ice Age 400 years ago. The absorbed CO2 volume was so large during the Little Ice Age that the atmospheric CO2 density dropped to less than half during the cold period, as has been measured in ice core data from stable ice formations. In younger ice formations, the measurements are distorted by the ice compaction process. The sharp increase that is shown here is not representative of what is real. Also, a portion of the atmospheric CO2 increase in modern time, small as it was in real terms, also reflects the reduced rate of CO2 being dissolved into the oceans during the warming period from the end of the Little Ice Age to the late 1990s. The man-made contribution to this ever-changing dynamics of the atmospheric CO2 recycling is, of course, too minuscule to be significant. In comparison with the World Trade Towers representing the global greenhouse effect, the man-made CO2 contribution is likely smaller than a mouse or even than a beetle. Man-made CO2 as a greenhouse gas only plays a role in the cave of deception behind the walls of cultivated ignorance. Of the few scientists who have progressed past the walls of ignorance, those who are beginning to recognize the deception and try to alert others of the fakery remain nevertheless working in the cave. They labor in the cave. Their work is ineffective there because they themselves don't focus on the real world. They form carbon global warming debating societies that debate factors of illusions. They are ineffective thereby because they find themselves not free from the carbon greenhouse doctrines, the doctrines that had chained them previously and to a lesser degree still do. only a minuscule view of the debating society who have actually ventured outside the cave into the real world begin to recognize that climate change is the effect of the ever-changing sun. They see the changing sun vividly evident in carbon-14 measurements and in other measurements of solar activity that measured the same results in different ways. To those standing outside the cave, CO2 is not a climate factor at all. The sun is the exclusive climate factor in the real world. Nevertheless, CO2 is an extremely critical factor outside the cave. In the real world, the CO2 density in the air is critically deficient. We don't have enough of it. CO2 is the stuff that all life depends on. The political war against CO2 inside the cave is a war against life itself. The CO2 concentration in the air has dangerously diminished over time and is now at the lowest concentration in the entire history of the development of life on Earth. We live in a CO2-starved world. When CO2's concentration diminishes to half of the current level, plant growth stops. If it diminishes to less, plants will die. We will encounter such conditions during the deep cold in the coming ice age, because large volumes of CO2 will then become dissolved into the oceans. We saw a noticeable decline in the CO2 concentration during the cold of the Little Ice Age, which had evidently contributed to the starvation crisis at that time, in which up to 30% of the population had perished by starvation. Of course, those very few who stand outside the cave on the climate front find themselves confronted also with the vastly bigger challenge of the full ice age itself that is near and real and is intensely critical. They discover that an ice age lies ahead. They discover that the last ice age glaciation period had coincided with a high rate of beryllium-10 production in the atmosphere throughout the entire glaciation period. They discover thereby an irrefutable proof that ice ages are caused exclusively by the sun, that is, by the sun hibernating, as it were, in a dramatically diminished mode. In this period of extreme cold, the global CO2 concentration will need to be artificially uplifted up to 10-fold to prevent the biosphere from dying that we all depend on and to invigorate it to healthy conditions. We also need to artificially increase the freshwater supply and distribution throughout the world, because the natural precipitation that we presently depend on will dramatically diminish with the diminishing sun, and the sun will greatly diminish. That's what the high level of the beryllium-10 production indicates. Under a weaker sun, solar cosmic reflux is naturally increasing, because a weak sun is less shielded against cosmic rays flowing from it. That's why high volumes of beryllium-10 are produced in the atmosphere, which are exclusively caused by cosmic rays affecting it. When the sun is hibernating, no plasma shield exists around it, whereby the Earth is exposed to the full solar cosmic ray flux. Hard measurements, as the beryllium-10 measurements, prove that Ice Age glaciation is caused by no other factor than the sun, that is extremely weak during the 90,000 years glaciation period, with 70% less solar energy being radiated, as we see the result reflected in ice core measurements. The ice core measurements also speak of a world with 80% less precipitation occurring during the glaciation period as a consequence of the weaker sun. Space-based measurements tell us that the start-up for the next weak period of the sun, the glaciation period on Earth, is extremely close as the 2050s, potentially. Past the exit from the Cave of Illusions, stepping into the real world, it becomes readily apparent, with the mind now paying attention to what science reveals, that the weakening of the solar system has been already ongoing for 3,000 years, but is now increasingly accelerating. The big historic global warming events have been getting weaker, and the intervals between them shorter. The system that drives this process is evidently collapsing. Likewise, the climate oscillations that gave us the little ice ages have diminished in amplitude over the last 1,000 years, and likewise too with shorter intervals between them. We cannot expect another recovery being caused by the resources of this system as in historic time from the now ongoing climate collapse, because this critical system too has collapsed dramatically. We have also measured the solar wind and saw it diminishing at a rate of 30% per decade. In addition, we have seen the sunspot numbers getting smaller and smaller correspondingly. Even the heartbeat of the solar system, its 11 years solar cycle, is now slowing down. It slowed from 11 years to 13 years. The current one may be as slow as 16 years for the cycle. All this points to a very real potential for the next ice age phase shift to be happening in the 2050s, when the sun's primospheres collapse, with which the sun flips back to its weak ice age hibernation mode. All of this widely based scientific knowledge gives the self-freed scientists, who no longer live in the cave, enormous creative power. The developed scientific knowledge enables the building of a completely new world with technological infrastructures that the sun's ice age climate change cannot touch, which, without these infrastructures, almost no one would survive. That's where we stand today, outside the cave. The challenge that we face is that the gained scientific knowledge cannot significantly change the imprisoned world, because the imprisoned people lack the depth in scientific recognition that would be needed for them to leave the cave and work together worldwide to save themselves. The acquired scientific knowledge is only recognizable outside the cave, in the real world. That poses a challenge that is not easily overcome, because nearly the whole of humanity presently clings to its prison cave. It is possible to inspire a type of scientific development in society that is rooted in the heart of our humanity, to raise it out of its imprisonment, by which the entire prison cave process becomes shut down. This feat was once achieved in some degree in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. A similar feat was accomplished in more modern time in the late 1800s in the USA. America's scientific pioneer in the spiritual realm, Mary Baker Eddy, had inspired scientific development in society on a wide platform of spiritual issues, in order that some of the long-standing, imprisoning religious dogmas can be left behind that have chained society throughout the ages to tragic illusions. She is one of the few who were able to shed their chains, climb over the walls of ignorance, and discover the mythological fire that is used to project fake images into people's world, images without substance. When she began to discover that there is nothing real in the cave, that the entire cave experience is mythological, she searched for the exit from the cave and found it. This happened in 1866 in a small town in Massachusetts. It occurred after a severe spinal injury that resulted from a fall on an icy street. According to the doctor's verdict, the injury would end up fatal. While she lay dying, she was searching for a way out of her dilemma in the context of the model that Christ Jesus had pioneered. At one point during the searching, she found herself suddenly well. What a shock! What a joy! She found herself outside the cave in the sunshine. She even opened the door to the minister who had come to her home that day in order to prepare her for death. He thought he saw a ghost at the door. She assured him that she was completely well. Her exit from the cave came with a lot of work attached. The work was required, and it was extensive. The work would span 44 years, exploring the world outside the cave. The world of reality that she discovered was purely spiritual. She discovered God as spirit, truth, love, mind, soul, and so on, and totally real. The initial work that she pursued in this line was so successful that she was able to heal others with what she herself had experienced and was beginning to understand about the spiritual nature of life reflecting God. She soon began to teach classes in order to enable others to heal likewise, which she did for roughly 20 years. And as the need arose, she authored a textbook of the science of her discovery. The first edition of it was printed in 1875. She constantly upgraded the book thereafter as her scientific recognition expanded. Over the years, her textbook appeared in over 400 editions under the title Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. The seal shown here first appeared in 1881 on the third edition of the book. Mary Baker Eddy ordained her textbook, together with the Bible, to serve as an impersonal pastor for the church that she founded. Later, she assigned 26 standard topics for lessons to be read from the books, repeated twice in a year, as the sermon for the Sunday church services. This arrangement closed the door to personal preaching and to politics and kept up the spiritual scientific direction. Mary Baker, as her maiden name was, like many people in her time, had been a student of the scriptures for many years. For her, those early years had been years of poor health, though she found hope in the scriptures that are filled with people's struggles throughout the ages to shed the chains that they wore in so many mental prison caves. In some biblical cases, evidently, a few pioneers had been able to climb over the walls of ignorance and discover the fires of mythology and the process that had created those shadow images without substance that false theologies and doctrines had inspired. In some accounts, too, the spiritual pioneers had discovered the path to the exit from their cave. While many of the Bible stories are fictional illustrations of spiritual concepts, some pertaining to times before written languages existed, they do, in their diversity, bring to light a rich tapestry of struggles by people in ancient times, all searching for some sort of solution to their problems. Mary Baker Eddy, as she became known in later years, combines the historic spiritual explorations found in scriptural texts with her own scientific explorations within the flow of the lesson sermons in her church. The combination furnishes a confluence of the spiritual discoveries from historic times with hers in modern time. While the scientific confluence doesn't create a new doctrine, it opens a door with an invitation to society to find its own exits from the numerous prison caves in which society is widely held impotent, small, docile, asleep, and imperiled. She states in her writings that she had hoped the world would welcome her work of reinstating primitive Christian healing on a high-level scientific basis. This turned out not to be the case. The reason for this failure likely was that her achievements could not be recognized within the prison walls of traditional small-minded perceptions. Some people who had recognized something were startled by her out of their dreaming, especially when they found themselves healed in the process. Some even ventured to the exits from their cave. But outside the prison caves, in the real world, she stood alone. To the very day, most of her advanced scientific work isn't even recognized to exist, and when it is faintly recognized, is deemed irrelevant. The fact that she painstakingly constructed all of her major works in conformity with John the Revelator's four-square city of God raised no eyebrows in her days, nor does it today. Right from the beginning in her work, she brought all her major scientific work into a single confluence that is structurally coherent with John's city of God. She created a confluence of 12 major scientific spiritual structures that in later years even included her church manual. Not a single part of this extensive, profound confluence, which invites exploration of the concepts involved, is officially or otherwise acknowledged to even exist, much less to be relevant to scientific spiritual healing. The tragic fact is that this denial of Mary Baker Eddy as a scientific pioneer runs very deep on all levels. The denial indicates to some degree the infinite distance that still exists between the freedom in science and the crippling effect of mental despotism that rules behind the imprisoning walls of learned ignorance. I am bringing Mary Baker Eddy's case up because the process that had inhibited her has not ended. Behind the walls of learned ignorance, there is typically nobody home. The scene is dead there, and the dead resist being pulled out of their slumber. This is still the case universally, whether the scene is spiritual, economic, or astrophysical, not to mention political. In each scene, we find the fire of mysticism, the walls of ignorance, and society in chains behind the wall being educated in the staged theater of illusions. In some advanced cases, we also find debating societies at work there, with noble and respective participants, but they all still operate within the cave, debating the virtues of illusions. The great debates about man-made global warming are staged in this environment in the cave, while in the real world the next ice age is fast approaching that nobody is allowed to even speak of, much less behold with the eye of science. This happens to the point that no preparations are made or considered to protect humanity against the Ice Age consequences that are more severe than anyone can yet imagine, much less anyone can survive without global-scale technological infrastructures for agriculture to continue on a planet of ice and universal drought. An ancient biblical proverb said, "Where there is no vision, the people perish." That's what the caves achieve for the cave masters. Against this background, the church that Mary Baker Eddy had established, that had once explosively expanded across the world, has collapsed in numbers and almost vanished over the years in the shadow of the ongoing denial of the underlying accomplishments that the church is founded on. Of course, the tragedy can also be reversed, and this in all arenas that are currently collapsing, with society remaining in the caves. It has been discovered that advanced scientific vision unfolds the potential to create a new world with a new renaissance in all those arenas that are now rapidly collapsing. We need this type of breakout to happen, and we need it fast. The blocking situation in the case of learned illusions that Mary Baker Eddy had encountered, which had blocked the unfolding of her science, is also encountered in almost all the fields of science that are of critical importance. The cave process has choked astrophysical science extremely. Measured astrophysical evidence suggests that the next phase shift to Ice Age glaciation will begin in the 2050s, with a 70% reduction in radiated solar energy being received on Earth, leading to deep glaciation, global cooling, and 80% less precipitation as a consequence. But while the evidence is monumental, to the vast majority of society, the measured evidence does not exist, who, by their denial, remain imprisoned in the caves of illusions, chained behind the erected walls of learned ignorance, dreaming of man-made global warming, and so on. The discovered opposing astrophysical facts that should change the world, which are plain facts outside the cave, are not relevant to a chained society. To the living dead, the real world outside the cave does not exist. Nevertheless, as Plato had indicated, it is possible for human beings to break their chains, rise above the walls of learned ignorance, and discover the truth with their own eyes, and to find their exits from the caves. While this remains yet to be accomplished, the potential exists within our humanity for such steps to be taken. The potential exists in all respects. When we see efforts being made to develop our humanity, when we see efforts in society to raise itself to ever higher levels of freedom, then a powerful breakout from the numerous mental prisons is not far distant. When we see worldwide nuclear disarmament happening and not just being dreamed of, we can see in this happening that something is moving at last, that a renaissance is beginning, which subsequently will open the field towards the global survival of humanity in the coming ice age, nourished by resources from a new world with infrastructures that do not yet exist, but that are possible to be built in a new renaissance. Civilization lives with development. Without it, it dies. Civilization can only be preserved on the path of development. This applies to all aspects of civilization. For example, when the focus of the Church of Christ scientist was shifted from its original mode of development to a mode of preservation where development is stopped, the Church collapsed and almost vanished. Its buildings are largely empty now, as they must be when the dynamism is gone. But the development potential still remains that Mary Baker Eddy had richly provided for, though it is presently denied. We see the same dynamics also reflected in the world of economics, where once the sky was the limit, dust became the outcome when development stopped. In the shadow of ever more billionaires reaping profit, the productive industries have collapsed, and society has fallen into homelessness, poverty, unemployment, drugs and crime. Without universal economic development, the path leads to the sewer of inhumanity. Even politics have collapsed on this path. They have become cries for war of countless sorts, for increased stealing. That's the mark of a society living in caves. But the phase of living in caves is in the process of ending. While the times are presently beset with horrors of economic collapse, financial collapse, scientific collapse, political collapse, even spiritual collapse, as the result of the intensified cave experiences that society still clings to. Civilization is nevertheless not rooted in collapse processes, but is rooted in progression, in a process that is boundless. The potential is great on this front for the cave days to end. For more than 3,000 years, civilization has been progressing. It began with the development of written languages and also living languages, as in the case of Homer. Next, we saw a great scientific development, the language of the mind, taking great leaps forward by the Pythagorean society. Then, 2 millennia ago, centuries after the great pioneers, and also after Plato, at Christmas time, a new age began. A phase shift happened that paved the way for humanity stepping ever more out of its cave experiences. With the advent of the Christ era, we celebrate a gift of God to humanity that blew the door wide open from the cave world to the real world. This single event started a new world, it pioneered the Christ idea of the divinity of man that defines man as the very image of God. And if history serves us well, the man, Jesus, who exemplified the Christ idea, had illustrated his divine perception on a wide platform of healing humanity, of its physical ills and diseases, as if to say to it, "Shed your chains, rise above the walls of ignorance, and be free by discovering that your life is no longer controlled by illusions, and then join my movement of healing outside the cave in the sunshine of truth." It appears that many people joined him on this note and became healers. At first his disciples, then Paul and many others, who discovered the amazing power to be free that is rooted in their humanity. Mary Baker Eddy rediscovered his spiritual power to be free of the cave experiences, of being no longer chained by sickness to the ground under the illusion that the body controls man. In 1866, Mary Baker Eddy discovered and taught others that the opposite is true, that the body is subject to the mind, reflecting the divine mind, that it is every human being's divine right to be free of sickness and bondage, and to live in the sunshine of spirit. Her message to humanity was that they have the power to make their life free by stepping out of the cave of illusions. Many did hear her. The Church of Christ Scientist was built on this spiritual platform for healing. When her time in the world ended, she had left behind a worldwide healing institution, an institution for scientific healing in the name of God. In 1902, 2 years before the large extension edifice was built, she had caused a 100-page chapter of fruitage to be added to her textbook, made up of testimonials of healing experiences caused by people simply reading her book. However, after her passing away in 1910, the dynamism faded instead of it spreading in ever wider circles. Historically, the years of her healing work from 1866 to 1910 stand out as a rare episode of peace and humanity in the world. The train of horrors had stopped. The bestial Inquisition had ended. The Opium War against China had ended. The American Civil War had ended. Apart from some minor events, the world was at peace. Then, after her passing, the train of horrors started rolling again, as if the world was being dragged back into the cave once more. World War I started, followed by World War II, followed by the Cold War that has not really ended, for which a nuclear arsenal is maintained now that has the largely automated potential to cause the extinction of humanity. The city of Dresden was eradicated in a single night of horror near the end of World War II in 1945. 500,000 people were burned to death. The city had no military significance. It was choked with 500,000 refugees fleeing the war. Children had been dancing in the street in anticipation that war was ending. Nor was the city destroyed by the Nazi terror orgy of Hitler. It was destroyed by the civilized world, the work of 1,000 heavy bombers manned by a crew of 4,000 airmen, who all did their duty, chained to inhumanity and whatever else rules in the cave. The fact that we are still far from realizing the potential that has been laid on the plate for humanity in the bright eras of its past and had been illustrated as achievable doesn't speak of us so much as a bunch of hopeless failures in the department of life, as it hints instead at the amazing scope of development that still lies before us as we dig ourselves out of the mental sewers of the caves with the power that we have already proved to some degree in the past, with which we ultimately are able to succeed on this path. This means that humanity isn't a decaying species, choked into impotence, bound to failures without hope, but is an infinite species with progressive potentials that we can't even imagine yet. The progressive potential of the Christ idea, of the divinity of man, applies to all fronts, from economics to science to technology, even to the spiritual front, and today as it had in times past. In all of these fronts we have barely begun to develop. This means that life and love are staged to become fuller, richer, with the potential to be unfolding more abundantly, as the Christ had promised, such as unfolding universally in ever wider circles. Abundant living and loving then means creating, producing, and enriching one another with our love and life and with the power and beauty of our humanity. This means to us that when we see the Ice Age challenge being acknowledged and placed on the front burner, and not denied or just being considered, but being accepted and mastered, we have come to the stage where we know with certainty that a new age of universal love is dawning in the world, whereby humanity will have an abundant future on a planet of largely ice and desert. Because we are man, parched ground can be watered, life can be nurtured technologically, while the climate on Earth will undergo the greatest phase shift in recorded history, potentially in the 2050s, which cannot be avoided. We have stepped out of the cave far enough to stage the greatest renaissance of all time, in which such archaic terms as poverty, hate, war, hunger, wealth, slavery, and so on are fast forgotten. The universe itself has provided a model for what economic development can achieve. The model is apparent in what it achieves in nuclear synthesis. Every atom in the universe is a construct produced by harmonizing principles that is 100,000 times larger than its constituent parts. This 100,000-fold gain should be the goal in economics. The 100,000-fold gain can be applied as a model when automated industrial production, high-temperature nuclear energy, and basalt as feedstock begin to produce a floating world bridge along the equator, with floating agriculture attached and floating cities produced with such ease that debt-free economics begins to unfold to meet the Ice Age challenge. The only debt that society owes to one another is to meet the human need. When the world bridge is built, this obligation is met. The debt is extinguished. Debt repayment becomes a thing of the past then. Fortunately, a faint beginning of this type of a new renaissance is already unfolding. It is unfolding from China, India, and Russia, and is unfolding in Africa and in many nations that have linked themselves up with China's Belt and Road World Economic Development Initiative. We are seeing the beginning of a new humanist age unfolding that promises the power we need to successfully meet the Ice Age challenge that we cannot avoid, that we must master without fail. The principle that brings us together on all of these fronts, scientifically, spiritually, politically, and economically, comes ever more to light as the principle of universal love. It had a faint beginning in the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Now it lies before us as our salvation. Love is a deep component of our universal humanity, by which our humanity is ultimately defined. Without it, civilization would collapse. Whenever in historic times the house of civilization was torn to the ground by empires with war, thievery, and mental despotism, the house of civilization was rebuilt with the one principle that proved to be enduring and developing evermore, which is the principle of universal love. In the wake of every war, civilization has resumed, and has resumed on a more universal platform. Universal love is the one impetus that has successfully broken many a despotic chain in countless caves, in countless different ways, under countless different names, ideals, and concepts. It has thereby enabled the self-healing of society and the dawn of ever wider freedoms, freedom from disease, oppression, hate, poverty, and the freedom to develop the human potential to the utmost. If today's society succeeds in building itself the critically needed new world of technological infrastructures that will enable civilization and human living to continue in the near Ice Age environment, then what is presently a near impossible seeming feat in today's largely privatized world will be accomplished as the result of humanity having raised itself to higher ground with the power of its greatest principle, the principle of universal love. The potential for this to happen is real, powered by the beauty of our humanity and its sublimity, and its sublimity and joy. The path for this resulting unfolding promises to be a path of exceedingly great challenges, great achievements, and freedoms that challenge the imagination.
向前，激流勇进，在潮头之巅，看新天无惧间重现新世界的旅途，美丽又遥远，我们公开窗缝，望无限。向前，迎接新日出，未来就在眼前。扬帆未来，我们携手向前，迎接新日出。心愿，愿时光停留这瞬间，让圆圆的月亮托起我烛